Austin, a warm welcome to GB News. Do you think Scotland is ready to go it alone?
Yeah, I mean, I think Scotland has always been ready to become an independent country, but it'll only be with the consent of the people of Scotland through a referendum. So, although that's my personal view, it would have to be for everyone in Scotland to decide. And once we do decide, we will be ready.
And what are the economic arguments, Austin, for Scotland going it alone?
Well, it was relatively interesting just looking at the last piece that we were talking about, the crisis that we're having in the Channel, and how we approach things. I mean, it isn't just about being financially better off. It's about the decisions that Scotland chooses to make economically, and how we choose to spend our money as well. So, I mean, I believe that there's many economic cases that we can make. There's many people on the independent side that may have a different view from me. Say, for example, the Campbell oil field. You have people like Alex Salmond who are arguing that we need that. To make a case for independence, and we've got other people on the other side of the independence, the pro-independent side, saying that we don't necessarily need that, but we should focus on renewables and the contribution that Scotland can make in that regard, which is what Keith Brown was referring to. So, as I say, there's a wide range of opinion even on the pro-independent side.
And yet, surely one of the great resources available to an independent Scotland is offshore oil, and yet Nicola Sturgeon won't touch that. Surely that diminishes the economic argument for independence.
Well, first of all, it isn't that oil isn't being touched. It's just that we don't want to do it. It's just that we're saying maybe it shouldn't be developed any further. But as I said, there's people on the independent side of the debate that may argue that those oil fields do have to be developed. So as I say, although I may have my personal opinion, and other people in the SNP and the Greens may have personal opinions in regards to that, there's going to be people on the pro-independent side that may argue that we have to develop the Campbell oil field. So as I say, one political party doesn't set the agenda. The Yes movement is a broad movement, and those arguments will be made during any pro-independence campaign once we have a referendum.
In the run-up to the referendum, of course, the argument under the leader of the SNP at the time, Alex Salmond, remember him? He actually said that that was one of the main arguments for an independent Scotland is the vast oil wealth at Scotland's potential. It seems that by not exploring oil capacity off the coast, Scotland is choosing to be poorer. But let's speak now to your opposite number. I'm delighted to welcome Jamie Green, Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament. Jamie, what's your view? Is Scotland ready to go it alone?
Good evening, and thanks for having me on. It's good to have a constructive debate about this issue with people who disagree with me. I think too often in Scotland, the debates become very bitter and divisive. And I think really to take the sort of romanticism out of it, we need to look at the facts. And it was interesting in your question about what is the economic case for independence. I mean, I listened carefully to every word that was said, and there was no case made. Which is part of the problem here. The reality is that Scotland has a very, very high level of public spending. This year alone, it's going to top around £100 billion. Even with all the oil in the world, and we know Nicola Sturgeon's position on oil and the revenue from that, which, by the way, was the foundation of the 2014 campaign and the white paper around Scotland's future. If you take away the oil revenue, then I don't know where on earth all this money is going to come from to pay for public services. And no one in the Yes movement, no one in the pro-independence movement has ever been able to answer that question, or indeed many other fundamental questions about Scotland's economy. And I'm afraid to say it does come back down to the economy, because it's the economy that pays for the vital public services that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So the whole case is sunk immediately solely on the case of the economic argument, if nothing else.
Of course, Jamie, you are a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament, and it's a Conservative government that delivered Brexit. I'm confident that global Britain will be a huge success. But my view is that it wasn't only economic arguments that caused people to vote for Brexit. It was emotional as well. The desire to control our borders, have sovereignty and basically manage our own economy. And that's what the Scots want, or perhaps half the Scots. Is that too much to ask? A Scottish independence is really just muck Brexit.
I've heard that phrase coined before, but again, you can coin all the phrases you like, but it doesn't answer the fundamental question about who's going to pay the public service pensions, what currency we're going to use, where all the revenue is going to come from to pay for public services like our NHS, like our teachers and our frontline police officers. All that money has to come from somewhere. Scotland already operates at a very high deficit. This year, it's going to be reaching around 22%. That's up from 8%. And let's not forget that the EU bar on accession to the EU is 3%. So, we're nowhere near that. It's just fantasy economics, I'm afraid. And it doesn't answer the fundamental question about no matter what you feel in your heart, your head tells you how on earth is the government going to be able to afford to deliver vital public services like social care reform, COVID recovery and economic growth, all the things that our country needs. And not just that, but it's about time that the Scottish Government actually put its eye back on the ball. Nicola Sturgeon herself admitted that she took her eye off the ball. Scotland has the highest drug death rate in the whole of Europe, for example. These are shameful statistics. And that's, I'm afraid, testament of government which is focusing on the Constitution and not getting on with the powers it already has to run the country. In Scotland, and the Scottish Parliament that I sit in is one of the most powerfully devolved parliaments in the world. It's about time that the SNP focused on that and stopped marching the troops up and down the hill on independence.
Austin Sheridan, Scotland is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It's also something of an economic powerhouse in its own right. I lived there for 4 years as an undergraduate of the University of Edinburgh, and I understand the emotional argument for an independent Scotland, and I think it's hypocritical to back Brexit but then question an independent Scotland. I think there are parallels. They're not the same, but there are parallels. Self-determination, sovereignty and freedom, and not only focusing on the economy. If there are problems, that will be Scotland's issue, and they will work to resolve that. And I think that's what you're fighting for in the SNP. But we're not kidding anyone, Austin, are we, to say that Scotland will be richer under independence? That ain't going to happen.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned there just regarding Brexit is I agree with self-determination. And for example, one of the areas I disagreed on is when the SNP took part on a UK-wide campaign for a people's vote. I was not in favour of that. I was quite in favour of England and Wales Brexiting because that's what they voted for. However, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain. Yeah, I agree with self-determination, absolutely. So there's not all SNP policy I agree with. But in terms of being richer, I mean, it all depends what you mean. I mean, financially richer, I believe that there certainly is a case that we can be. However, it's about where do we have our spending, our priorities, right? So do we spend, for example, hundreds and billions of pounds on nuclear weapons and, on
Scotland
the Clyde?
safe.
Do we choose to spend our money that way? Do we choose
National
to have
security.
a draconian immigration system? For example,
Stop illegal
where
immigration.
people are seeking asylum, they don't have the right to work, whereas we could give them the right to work in order to contribute to our economy and contribute tax. I mean, these are the decisions that we can make as an independent country that at the moment we can as being part of the Westminster system.
Austin, we saw the Chancellor, didn't we, borrow in the direction of £500 billion in the course of the pandemic. Would an independent Scotland be able to borrow so cheaply?
Yeah, well, I mean, an independent Scotland wouldn't have to borrow that amount of money anyway. We know that much.
Well, in relative terms, does Scotland have the buying power on the international bond markets that the UK has, Austin? Of course not.
I mean, however, Scotland could have borrowing powers,
no
but as you say, it's all about where do we prioritise the spend as well. For example, would we be choosing to spend, £100 billion on the new nuclear weapons? Would Scotland's share of the money go towards that?
Safe,
no.
Protecting us from China and Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point, you've mentioned nuclear weapons. This is about national security. The people of Scotland will be less safe in an independent Scotland if there's no nuclear deterrent.
Well, I don't entirely see how nuclear weapons keep us safe. There's many countries in the world that don't have a nuclear deterrent. And
Because
as
we
far
do.
as I'm aware, they're perfectly safe. The biggest threat that we have to this country is terrorism, which is actually a policing matter. Under the SNP, we've increased our policing numbers in England. The Tories cut policing numbers. That's where the Scottish Government had their priority. When the Westminster Tories chose to cut police numbers when they came into office. So, as I say, when it comes to our security, the Scottish Government have performed much better in that regard.
Jamie Green, an independent Scotland is partly an emotional issue. Half the people, or perhaps almost half of the people in Scotland, maybe more, they just want to be free. They want self-determination. What would you say to those people?
Well, Mark, we are free. You know, we are free. We had a referendum in 2014, which wasn't that long ago, and the Scottish people resoundingly decided to remain part of the UK. That decision was made. All parties in that referendum said it would be once in a generation, once in a lifetime, however you want to phrase it, and you can argue over how long a lifetime is these days. But the point is that it wasn't that long ago, and I really think that people watching your show and people right across Scotland will be thinking, why on earth is the Scottish Government, why on earth are civil servants that I'm paying for, that taxpayers are paying for, sitting in their offices drafting white papers on referendums about independence when we are in the middle of, and I am reminded of this daily by the First Minister, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and that is the excuse for pretty much everything that comes out of the SNP. So if we are in the middle of a global pandemic, so be it. Why on earth are taxpayers' money being spent drafting white papers on independence? They must have better things to do with their time, like focusing on the economic recovery and getting our NHS and social care system up to standards that we can deal with any future pandemics or challenges that it faces. And I think, you know, I hear your point, Mark, about the romantic element of this. But as I said, the last time in 2014, we put that argument to the Scottish people, and it came down to their wallets, came down to their heads, and it came down to the sensible decisions that we had to make about who on earth is going to pay for public services when our public spending is reaching £100 billion a year. And the UK block grant, it underpins the Scottish economy, and everybody knows that. Whether you like it or not is another matter. But to throw that away, to cut that off, why on earth would we do that?
Well, Jamie, if you're so confident in the case, I'll come straight back to you, Austin. But Jamie, if you're so confident in the case for the United Kingdom and Scotland staying in the Union, grant the Scots another referendum. From what you're saying, you'll walk it.
Why should we have another referendum now when there are still people dying in our hospitals of COVID, when we're still closing our borders to flights from overseas, when we heard today about a new variant of COVID, which is of huge concern to the government and which underpins most of the restrictions that we're still living under? I genuinely think that whatever your views on independence, whether you're for or against it, people right now in Scotland have other priorities. They're worried about the climate change. They're worried about the NHS. They're worried about how they're going to pay their bills, about the rising cost of energy. They're not worried about these constitutional arguments, which seem to revolve solely around what is said at an SNP conference. And I think it's about time those SNP ministers in Holyrood took their fingers out of their ears, started listening to the people of Scotland who just want them to get on with governing and being a sensible, coherent government that focuses on the day-to-day issues that really matter to people, not the Constitution.
A sensible, coherent government like the one in Westminster. I'll put a final point to you before I come back to my SNP guest, Jamie. I want to ask you, Jamie, though, the deputy leader of the SNP, Keith Brown, has said that the campaign for independence will actually save the planet. What's your view on that?
I mean, Keith Brown is on another planet himself at the moment. You know, what on earth is he talking about? The UK government, with the Scottish government, and bearing in mind that COP26 was a huge success in my view, and it was a good testament of how both of Scotland's governments can work together positively to influence the rest of the world, and I think we did that. But the idea that somehow Scottish independence is going to deliver you know, some sort of global you know, shift in climate change, I mean, I haven't heard any evidence to suggest how he thinks that's going to happen. I'd be very keen to hear his arguments for it. But the point being is that when we do work together, whether it's within the UK, whether it's across the world, when we work together and not against each other, that's how we can achieve things. And I think the UK government has proven that in its ambition for climate change. And these are tough decisions that all governments will have to make. But, you know, Keith Brown's living in fantasy land if he wants to direct the civil servants to start writing white papers instead of getting on with his own day job, which is sorting out criminal justice in Scotland.
Yes, I mean, Austin, what's your view about the comments of the deputy leader of the SNP that independence will save the planet? He's obviously been on the Drambuie.
Well, do you know something? An independent Scotland will have very ambitious targets in order to bring down our emissions and contribute to the world. And I believe that that's the point that he was trying to make. But just in terms of what Jamie Green was saying there, in terms of COP being a success, I don't really think it was very successful when you had the Prime Minister of the UK standing up in front of our leaders trying to persuade them that Westminster isn't corrupt. I don't think that was very successful. Very interesting as well that Mr Green says that we should be focusing on the COVID pandemic, when in actual fact his Conservative colleagues in the Scottish Parliament have been virtually against every measure that the SNP government have taken to try and contain the virus. Also very interesting as well that he doesn't recognise the fact that Nicola Sturgeon has made clear that we won't have a referendum until we have came out of the pandemic era, or
how do you define that, Austin?
to do so. However, Jamie Green fundamentally says what gives the Scottish Government the right to start moving forward with plans for an independence referendum. Well, that's because the people of Scotland have elected the largest pro-independence majority parliament that we've seen since 1999. And in the SNP manifesto and in the Scottish Green manifesto, there was a clear commitment to hold an independence referendum. So if
coalition,
that
Austin,
doesn't give us the democratic mandate to hold a referendum, I want to put the question to Mr Green, what is the democratic route to referendum?
What's your question, very briefly? What's your question to Jamie?
I want to know what the democratic route to an independence referendum is, because the Scottish people have elected the largest pro-independence parliament as in favour of a referendum.
Jamie, very briefly, if you can you answer?
Yeah, it's an easy one. The SNP lost their majority again at the last Scottish parliamentary election.
We've got a pro-independence parliament.
You asked me a question, please let me answer. It's only through their dodgy coalition with the Green Party, and let's look across Europe and see how they work out.
Was there a Dem coalition in Westminster?
Cool your boots, Austin.
I know you don't like it, but the Scottish people decided against separation, and I'm sorry, but let's wait that generation and let's have that argument then.
Well, gentlemen, just on that one, right?
To both of you, a
the Unionists had a majority in the Scottish Parliament, I would have to accept it. I would have to accept a Unionist majority if it was the case.
Well, look, Jamie and Austin, I'm keen to welcome you back. Clearly, this conversation will continue. I'm so grateful to both of you for giving up a portion of your Friday evening to debate it. You were listening to Jamie Green, Conservative Member of Parliament for the Scottish Parliament. Also, former SNP Glasgow City Councillor Austin Sheridan.